looking at something that's a little bit closer to Earth. Episode 3 is Moonstruck. We're going to be talking about the moon and our relationship to it, particularly in a little bit of a romantic perspective because of Valentine's Day coming close by. This is as close as Down to Earth will come to it being a Wednesday night show, but hey, we'll just talk about it a little early. So initially, talking about the moon, we have a lot to learn from it. And when we look at it, we see things like phases of the moon and it going around the Earth. We see things like it turning from a crescent moon to a gibbous moon to a full moon. I think we have some pictures of the moon as it evolved through the Slooh cameras that we can show just that evolution of that. Yeah, here's one of the ones from when it was a crescent moon, and then it gets a little bit bigger, a gibbous moon, and then we have a full moon. And so the moon waxes and wanes, becomes bigger and smaller over a 29 and a half day moon cycle. So we have a lunar month. And so we see this consistent change in the moon as we go throughout that. And we also, as it goes around us, as the moon orbits around us, we see it get closer and further away from us, and things that we call apogee and perigee. Apogee being when it's at its furthest point away, 252,000 miles away. And then it gets a little bit closer to us at perigee at 226,000. And so here we see the comparison of these two times of perigee and apogee from the Slooh telescopes, with apogee being on the left, perigee being on the right. And so this moon is such an interesting topic because it's so ever changing in our night sky. From one night to another, it's going to look different. It's going to be a different phase. It's going to be different in terms of closeness to us. And so we see this ever evolving thing. And so it's a great thing to look at through the Slooh telescopes. We have a slew of images regarding the moon all the time that are coming through. And a little bit different in terms of changing on the scale when compared to like the Black Eye galaxy, just because there's a lot more going on that we can see close up. Not that there's not a lot going on in that galaxy, but in terms of what we can see. And so he looks at these differences all the time. But tonight, the major topic that we're going to discuss is how the moon is down here on Earth, how the moon impacts us directly. And of course, one of the big ones that people like to talk about is the tides, and how the moon is a big effect on the tides of Earth, how we have high tide and low tide, spring tide and neap tide, in large part because of the moon and what the moon does. And so, if the moon is directly overhead, then that's when we get high tide. And if the moon is sort of on the side of where we are on the planet, then that's when we have a lower tide. And so we tend to get high tides about twice every day because of what the moon does. But so we have the tides, we have it affecting Earth somehow. But let's get even deeper into the moon and ourselves and our relationship with the moon on this Valentine's show. So, what about us? How does the moon directly affect us? Some people actually used to wonder if the moon affected humans like it affected the tides, because we are mostly water. We're mostly made up of water. But no, the effect of the moon, the tidal force of the moon on us, is about the equivalent of if a mosquito were going to land on our arm, a similar force. So it's not something that really, really affects us. And we don't have Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I'm so sorry there were a couple of technical difficulties in the studio, but now I believe that we're back on live and ready to continue our show of the third episode of Down to Earth. Thanks so much again for being patient, and I'm sure it'll be smooth sailing from here on. Just a quick recap. What we're going to be talking about tonight, we're talking about the moon. And we've talked about it before in terms of the phases, how close or far away from us it is. We look at these things all the time on Slooh, but tonight we're going to be talking about how the moon impacts us here on Earth. And so one of the big ones that we like to talk about when it comes to how the moon affects the Earth is the tides and what the moon does to the tides. I mean, it looks absolutely beautiful above the ocean. You can see many wonderful pictures of just the moonlight reflected on the sea or on the lake. Just beautiful stuff. But what the moon actually does is, if it's right overhead, that's when we tend to get high tide. Or if it's to the side of where we are, that's when low tide tends to be. So we tend to get over, a rotation of the Earth, a couple of high tides and low tides as the moon continues its cycle about. So the water moves, but how do we move in concert with the moon? How does the moon affect us humans? How does it directly affect us? Is the question. And I'm actually asking that question. So tonight, if you feel like you have the answer, like how the moon affects you, please do type it into the chat box. Depending on your browser, you'll either see this chat box right to the right of the show or beneath it, and I'll be checking over to see what you might be saying throughout the show. And yeah, we're back online. Thanks for sticking with us, Stephen. And so I'll be looking at what people are saying, and maybe we'll talk about sort of how you feel that you're affected by the moon. I'm going to talk about a little bit here about some of the possibilities. And one of the things that people used to think is that maybe the moon affected humans like it affected the tides, because we're made of a lot of water, after all. But this is actually not the case. A astronomer was once quoted as saying that a mosquito would exert the same amount of force if it landed on your arm as the tidal forces of the moon exert on us. So really not much. And even less so because we don't have to worry about the moon sucking our blood. So it's great. Not really big effect there. But if you look into different theories for how the moon affects us, most of the time when it comes to physical stuff, there doesn't tend to be a lot of scientific evidence toward it. One thing, for example, is that there really aren't werewolves. I don't think there are werewolves. I don't think that's a thing. Also, you can think about fertility. That's not really in any terms that we've been able to measure affected by the cycles of the moon, things like that. But even though there aren't these special magical ions that are physically changing us, the moon still means something to us, and it has meant something to us for a very long period of time. And really, in particular, that place has been emotional. I'm sure maybe a couple of you have heard the lyric, "When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's amore." So it's love, that's amore. The moon is love. We associate the moon with love and romance. And why? Why do we do this? When you objectively look up at the moon, like you look up at it here on your screen even, it's a big cold rock that's floating in space. It's not smiling at us. It's not honking its horn in the middle of saying there's too much space traffic, you got to go faster, Earth. It's not doing any of that. There's no inherent emotion that's built into this moon. And yet we associate with the moon so much emotion, passion, intrigue, mystery, love. And this isn't just a recent phenomenon. It didn't just start with Lady and the Tramp sharing some meatballs under the moonlight. So it's been around for a while, this trope. Let's go back to about 10th century Japan, say, and the tale of the bamboo cutter. So this is a very old tale. It's been around for over 1,000 years. And in this tale, there was a bamboo cutter, surprisingly enough, who, when he was cutting bamboo, he found this tiny little princess inside one bamboo stalk. And so he took her back home and he decided to raise her. This was Kaguya-hime. And so Kaguya-hime grew up and grew older, and she became absolutely beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. So all the royalty and all the land, the princes, the emperors, they all wanted her hand in marriage, and none of them ever quite got it. Uh, she was incredibly beautiful and also absolutely unattainable. She had this beauty that was almost otherworldly. And it turns out that it actually was, because Kaguya Hime was from the moon. She was a descendant of the moon people. And eventually, as the story progresses, she has to return back to the moon, and she leaves a lot of broken hearts behind her. And so this story, Kaguya Hime, is in some ways entirely relatable to the visage of the moon itself. That's something that's beautiful beyond us. We can reach out to it, but we can never quite grasp it. Nobody can ever quite take the moon into their own hands. And so even 1,000 years ago, this idea was still there, and this relationship with the moon being this love of ours, it was very present. And this isn't the only example of this. So we can head a little bit further on into the history of the world, into 19th century Europe, where Beethoven composed a rather gorgeous sonata, one that you might have heard of, called the Moonlight Sonata. And the Moonlight Sonata, this is one that he dedicated to one of his students, who supposedly he was incredibly fond of. Some say that he potentially even loved. This was Countess Giulietta. And so for Countess Giulietta, so this was a sonata made with her in mind, and so it was one composed on strong emotional feelings, strong feelings of, some might say, love. One interesting thing about the Moonlight Sonata, though, is that it wasn't always called the Moonlight Sonata. Beethoven called this Piano Sonata number 14 in C sharp major, or C sharp minor, opus 27, number 2. He didn't name this the Moonlight Sonata. What happened was that a critic who saw this or heard this Moonlight Sonata, what he did was he was quoted as saying that the first movement to him was like a boat passing the wild scenery of Lake Lucerne in the moonlight. So he experienced this piece that Beethoven wrote in a strongly passionate mood. And what he heard the moon. Beethoven didn't say the moon. Beethoven wasn't like, hey, I wrote this with the moon in mind. No, he was composing this with strong feelings of passion in mind, and then somebody else hears it and hears the moon. Not only do they hear the moon, but the Moonlight Sonata becomes such a popular name for this piece that everybody knows it as the Moonlight Sonata. Everybody hears this piece that is incredibly dripping with romance. And appropriately to many people, it is called the Moonlight Sonata. Very, very important. And so we have, I'm just looking here, we have a couple of people that are asking some questions here. Somebody's asking, I know a few mothers in an autism parents group that say their kids act up during a full moon. Can that be true? And so there are lots of people that talk about how the time of the full moon is the time when everybody sort of gets a little bit wild and more spirited, and that it's the time when you give in a little bit to your more fundamental nature. And so there are a lot of anecdotal stories about this, but when and there's been actually a lot of scientific studies on this as well, and there haven't been any studies that have been able to correlate human behavior with the phases of the moon. They haven't been able to say that, oh, the full moon will make you act up. So while there are a lot of stories, there isn't yet really any evidence to support that may be the case. But it is interesting that people do feel this relationship to the moon, that they feel that there's some sort of powerful connection on the full moon. And even if it isn't something that physically happens, that something that is physically like beaming into them, that emotional connection can mean something if you are emotionally relating to it in a certain way. And so to go further into our relationship with the moon, there was a story that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote in 1925 called Rover Random. And this was when a dog got turned into a toy by a wizard. And so this dog traveled to the moon, and he went in search of this wizard to try and find him and try and be turned back into a real dog. And so, yeah, this is a story about the moon and a dog going there, but where's the love part? Where's the love relationship to the moon? This is where we dig a little bit deeper. And actually, this story was created by Tolkien for his son. In particular, he was creating this story when his son was very sad when he lost his beloved toy dog on a trip. So Tolkien, with the creative license of an author, could have sent this dog anywhere in the universe, and in any shape or form. But he chose to send this dog on a journey to the moon. And so that again ties in the question, like what is this relationship with the moon where we connect it with the things we love and potentially with the things that we've lost? It's very, very, very interesting to look into. And so why have we through the centuries loved the moon so much in this way? And there's no real definitive answer out there for our emotions, for the emotions that we carry. But I can tell you a little bit about some of the thoughts that I have on the subject that we can explore. And that is that this moon is the closest unknown that we have that's away from Earth. It's something that can really inspire imagination like the rest of the universe does. Like we were looking at a galaxy just before this show, which was incredible. I mean, it has hundreds of billions of stars in this. It's millions and millions of light years away from us. And it could have countless other worlds in it with countless other potentially living things. There's endless possibilities and endless beauty out there. But in comparison with a galaxy that even if we traveled our whole lifetime at the speed of light that we could never even get close to, the moon is in some other ways, it's obtainable. And we've landed on it. We've flown on it. And isn't there something about love that for many of us, it may seem distant, even though it's there, it's close. It may seem in some ways distant, almost magical. That this otherly world that looks so beautiful, but like moonbeams, can be fleeting and difficult to catch. And just to sort of support this sort of train of thought, there is the word honeymoon, which there's actually there's a couple theories around the world about how honeymoon came to be the word honeymoon. And I can tell you a couple of them, which one of them is that this is the period of time after the wedding when the feelings of romance and the feeling of love are strongest. So it's the month, that moon cycle of honey. It's a sweet time. And the other possibility that a lot of people say is that it stemmed from the way that a bride's father would have given the groom free mead or honey beer for a month after the wedding. So sweetness for a month in either way. But with both of these possibilities, really of celebration and wonder that may sometimes give way to something that is less or more. Like the phases of the moon, our emotions and our romance, it changes, it evolves. It's constantly in flux, just as the moon in our sky, as we talked about, the phases of the moon is always changing from day to day. It's getting closer to us, it's getting further away. But maybe, just maybe, that might be one of the comforts that we have in our relationship with the moon, is that every night it changes. But at the end of the day, it is always, always going to be there. And so now, as we're heading sort of near to the end of our broadcast, keep in mind that I'm going to be on chat a little while after the show to answer some more of the questions that you have. And I've been loving all the conversation that I've been seeing over there. And I'm also going to talk a little bit in the chat about the gamma ray burst question that somebody had last week that I'm going to answer in a little bit more detail. But first, to play us out, I wanted to recite to you a poem that I felt really got to the heart of this issue. It's a poem that's called Moon Song by Robert William Service. A child saw in the morning skies the dissipated looking moon, and opened wide her big blue eyes and cried, "Look, look, my lost balloon, and clapped her rosy hands with glee. Quick, mother, bring it back to me. A poet in a lilied pond espied the moon's reflected charms, and ravished by that beauty blonde, leapt out to clasp her in his arms. And as he'd never learnt to swim, poor fool, that was the end of him. Two lovers watched the new moon hold the old moon in her bright embrace. Said she, "There's mother, pale and old, and drawing near her resting place." Said he, "Be mine, and with me wed." Moon high she stared, she shook her head. A soldier saw, with dying eyes, the bleared moon like a ball of blood, and thought of how in other skies, so pearly bright on leaf and bud, like peace its soft white beams had lain, like peace. He closed his eyes again. Child, lover, poet, soldier, clown, ah yes, old moon, what things you've seen. I marvel now, as you look down, how can your face be so serene? Tranquil still you'll make your round, old moon, when we are underground. Now, that's all for Down to Earth for tonight. And I wish all you stargazers out there a beautifully, breathtakingly good night.